Hello. We're here today to look at the 2024 Aries Ingress for Australia. My name is Kim Fairminer. If you haven't met me before, I write horoscopes that appear in publications primarily in Australia, but also overseas. I'm a contributing author for the cult indie witchcraft books, Living Witchery, Beginning Witch Guide, and Living Witchery Divination. And I'm currently working on an Oracle deck manuscript with Blue Angel Publishing. So I do a lot of writing and I also do a lot of astrology. I wanted to get like a little promo thing out of the way. It's more of like a freebie that I'm doing because not only do we have the Aries Ingress coming up, we also have Eclipse season, not hot on its heels, not too far away at all. And in the for the solar eclipse for Aries, I'm going to host like a little online anti-challenge type thing. It's free to participate, and like it will be in the lead up to the 3 days before the solar eclipse, and it'll be open to anyone who's interested in releasing outdated patterns of behavior before the solar eclipse happens. So it's particularly good if you're healing issues around codependency and people pleasing and wanting to create space to welcome courage and authenticity into your life. Okay, we'll do a quick whirl around the mundane significations of the houses. Basically, the houses in astrology are like topics or areas of activity. And you're probably familiar with the ascendant in your natal chart being about you, the 7th house being about your relationships, the 10th house, your career, the 4th house, home. So the basic significations when we take those ideas from natal astrology into mundane astrology, and mundane is the name that we give the branch of astrology that looks into collective endeavors, aspirations, events that occur, on the ground on Earth, with like countries like Australia. But we'll just have a look at how, you can see here the first house here, much like the ascendant in a natal chart, is kind of like the leading house for the Ingress chart that we're going to look at. It will describe Australia, its people, and just generally the overall prosperity and health, because that house is connected to vitality. The second house, the money house, it's still all to do with money, wealth, and financial assets. The third house is linked to propaganda, media, and neighboring countries. So, when we look at it for a natal chart, we're looking at, siblings and, our neighbors over the other side of the fence. When we're talking about a country, it's, our international neighbours, people in our region. So perhaps for Australia, we'd think about like New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, the Pacific Islands, those kind of countries that are really, in our neck of the woods. The 4th house is deeply connected to the land, farming, mining, also real estate, which I always just kind of have to have a bit of a look at. I've got some 4th house significations in my chart, so I'm always like, and it's such a big part of the national conversation in Australia at the moment. The 5th house relates to diplomats, kind of like that idea of an intermediary, somebody that kind of goes between two people. It's also to do with leisure, sport, the arts, and also like the children as well. The 6th house is the working class. So people that are working as like, nurses, teachers, laborers, unions there as well. So this isn't like kind of like the glamour house. These are the people that are, fueling, that are working in the engine room of the nation and keeping things chugging on. It's also related to food reserves. So kind of like this idea of the national pantry. The 6th house and the 4th house regarding food production, you'll see, because the 4th house is farming, the 6th house is, the food that those farms produce. I think perhaps supermarket workers would be in the sixth house as well. And supermarkets are certainly a hot topic in Australia at the moment. That brings us to the seventh house, where we find our partners, but also our enemies. It's also a really important house when we're looking at whether there's going to be conflict or peace and agreements. So we have treaties there as well. The eighth house, the house of death and debt, is related to taxes, disasters also as well. So, you're probably looking at things like floods and drought in that house. The ninth house is like our international relations at the broader scale. So people that are further away, not our local neighbors, not people in our region, countries in our region, but, like, I guess the United States, China, Europe, Africa, like all those other countries and, continents that are not really kind of close to us and don't have an immediate impact, but we might get involved with them. Like, what happens, for instance, in Ukraine had an influence in Australia, but we wouldn't sort of class Ukraine as a neighbor. So this is sort of further away. It also links to the travel industry and higher education, like universities and religious institutions. The 10th house, I would say, is the second most important house, particularly in mundane charts. So if the first house is the people, the 10th house is the authorities, the government. So the ruler of the 10th house is the prime minister. So we'll be taking a look at, what his planet's doing in a second. And the 11th house here is the parliament. So all the politicians that are hanging out down in Parliament House are belong in the 11th house here. It's also like government resources because it's the second house, so asset from the 10th. And it's also like our hopes and dreams and our aspirations as a people, as a nation. And then we have the 12th house, which are people that are kind of like closeted away from mainstream society. So hospitals, prisons, detention centres, and also spies and espionage lurks in this funny little corner. Now, let's move on to our next slide. I wanted to do a bit of a review of last year. I mean, looking forward and making predictions is all good fun in astrology, but I think it pays to look back to confirm your previous predictions and just see how you went. Now, last year, I did this Aries Ingress exploration with my friend Sam from Three Fates, and our webinar is still up on YouTube, but I just wanted to do a pretty quick run through of what we predicted and what happened, because we so sort of, we nailed it, but yeah, we nailed it. We made some really perhaps out there predictions at the time, but like things really, that it proved that the astrology works. So we predicted with this Jupiter on the ascendant here that there was an overestimation of the country's capabilities. And one of the ways it played out was with the huge and largely unanticipated increase in the number of students and migrants. You'll see here that Jupiter rules the ninth house of foreigners, and here they come to Australia. Good on them. So Jupiter rules the ninth house of university and foreigners, and it's really strongly positioned here on the ascendant. Also in relation to Jupiter, there were issues with political prisoners, that brought about by our relationship with, far away other countries. That's very clumsily worded, I apologize. But international extraditions and new laws and legal reforms, possibly, actually, that's a direct quote. Also in relation to Jupiter, we identified issues with political prisoners, international extraditions, new laws and legal reform, possibly with unintended consequences. So we had the release of Australian journalist Cheng Lei from a Chinese prison in the 2023 Ingress year. Julian Assange was again in the spotlight. I think we're still waiting for that final, supposedly, extradition judgment from the UK court. And Yang Hengjun was sentenced to death a few weeks ago by a Chinese court. And these were all like people working in the field of journalism and, basically locked up in foreign prisons. So there was also the surprise ruling from the High Court, which mandated the release of highly dubious characters from indefinite detention. And I think that qualifies as unintended consequences of law reform. So the ruler of this 2023 chart is Mars, and that's down here in Gemini in the 3rd house. Sam and I identified competitive diplomacy in the Pacific region with neighbouring countries such as Papua New Guinea. And it was the PNG Prime Minister who made an historic address a couple of months ago to the Australian Parliament. And there was also a large increase in regional aid with an emphasis on defence and policing. Mars is, the warrior planet. So in the dual sign of Gemini, that kind of idea of partnering with neighbours really strongly came to the fore. We also predicted issues with information exchange, particularly in the areas of news and the internet, where there was maybe a lack of a filter or safety net. And that was indicated by this debilitated Mercury, which is tucked away in the 12th house of this 2023 Ingress chart. So it's interesting that in the news sort of, in the last week or two, that Meta has recently pulled the pin on the government's news publishing deal that, required them to pay for the news that they republished. Pluto's also prominent at the top of this chart, and nuclear submarines were the talk of the town a year ago. And kind of a bit out of left field, in the weeks leading up to this Aries Ingress, I think it's still in the news cycle at the moment, the opposition has, the Liberal National Party has announced that they're in favour of nuclear power stations. So we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on what Pluto's going to be doing in this year's chart. So in my humble opinion, the feather in our hat for the 2023 Ingress was the call on secret deals and espionage activities occurring which undermine Australia's national interest. And that was based on all the 12th house activity here. And so only a few weeks ago, the head of ASIO revealed that a sitting politician in, I think it was about 2018, had been recruited by foreign spies. That's still like a mystery because he didn't go ahead and name names. But that was quite unusual. But yeah, it's right here in this Ingress chart. We also successfully predicted the end of interest rate increases, fuel, and the extra money being collected by the government due to sort of, various economic conditions. But yeah, that's enough about the year that was. Let's have a look at this year and find out what lies ahead. Okay, so this is the 2024 chart. I always go in the chart through the ascendant. It's just, I don't know, like it's the sign that's rising in the east. And in a mundane chart, it tells us about the health and vitality of the nation at a collective level. And it certainly looks like we're feeling chatty and erudite with Gemini rising. So Gemini's a mutable air sign. So that brings a certain lightness and flexibility to Australia in the coming year. And it bodes well for adapting to whatever events and conditions come our way. There's also a rationality that we can draw upon as a nation to help us enact our goals. So, maybe we want to dive a little bit deeper past the headlines and slogans and things that we're usually sort of fed in the media cycle and are willing to go a little bit deeper. Because, like, the associations with Gemini are about news, media, local transportation, and education, this suggests that those topics will be a priority for Australia in the coming year. I do want to quickly point out, though, that you look at that 26 degrees rising there, and up the top of the chart in the ninth house, we've got Neptune there in Pisces, and that creates a 90-degree square to the rising degree. And that flexibility and adaptability could veer towards dishonesty and deception. Particularly sort of, to do with those ninth house topics, like those international relations, religious institutions, higher education. The ascendant's also emboldened by the trine. You've got Mars here in Aquarius at 27 degrees over in the eighth house. And that's actually a more supportive aspect because a trine is from air sign to air sign here. And from the eighth house, it's not kind of, great because the eighth house is connected to those darker topics of, death, debt, and disaster. The 3 Ds. But we'll come back to, what this could be later. But like those are the two planets that are influencing the ascendant. So because Gemini is rising, Mercury is the chart ruler and takes on special importance in this chart. It's a fascinating Mercury. It's up here in Aries in the 10th house, which is a strong placement for the ruling planet. It's still direct, but this Mercury is actually slowing down before the retrograde cycle, which begins on the 3rd of April. So like before Mercury comes to a standstill, it actually kind of slowly brakes, puts the brakes on rather than the accelerator before turning back over the degrees it's previously covered. So when in Aries, Mercury favors direct and assertive communication and has a tendency to generate new ideas and also tends to jump to conclusions. There's a hastiness here that's further encouraged by the proximity to the North Node, which, as the dragon's head, has a hunger and a drive. And in this case, that hunger and drive is for mercurial things like the media, telecommunications, education, and publishing. So Aries fast, slowing Mercury is kind of like counterintuitive to that. And it's as if that, there's this desire for speed, for pace, like ends up meaning that we have to go back and do something over again. So as a nation, we want this momentum. We want this speed. The Mercury-Aries combination wants to get cracking and move forward without pontificating too much. There's debate, lively debate at that, but Mercury's in a fire sign and it also wants to do things, not just talk about them. So I'm wondering sort of, being up here in the 10th house of the government, if the, legislation and things that the government passes will need to come back and be further tweaked because they basically, are a bit hasty and perhaps miss some details that only later will be sort of uncovered and refined. So right next to Mercury is Chiron. I don't generally place a huge lot of importance on Chiron, but for some reason I've got him showing up in my, chart settings, and it certainly does add another layer to Mercury here. Chiron was a centaur. It's one of those mythological Greek creatures that was a horse from the waist down and then a human from the waist up. So there's this idea of wildness and civility coming together with Chiron. He was a bit different to the other centaurs who definitely tended towards the wilder end of the spectrum. And this kind of suggests that the bold ambitions that the government has, particularly around education policy, I would suggest, because of the proximity to Mercury, and also the fact that Chiron was a teacher and educated, many a Greek hero. And because of Chiron's connection to healing, Chiron in the myth was immortal, but was shot with a poison arrow and couldn't die. Like he sort of, endured excruciating pain. Fun. So this to me also suggests that there's research or a white paper that the government's going to do regarding health policies. I've also got this suggests the government could develop policy around how to use technology. Mercury is a bit of a techie planet to deliver education and health outcomes. So I attended a QFA meeting. That's my local astrology chapter on Monday night. And a fellow astrologer, Lynn Smith, observed that this North Node Mercury Chiron combination suggests that the world, because this Ingress chart applies to the whole world, could be grappling with complex problems in the year ahead. And Aries, I feel, adds a sense of urgency, particularly for Australia, as it's positioned so prominently in the 10th house. So Mercury rules the 12th house as well as the first house. So I'm wondering if it's likely to bring up some issues, policy development around mental health and brain diseases, which could come to the fore in some way. And also because that 12th house is connected with spies and espionage, particularly through online hacking, that techie dimension of Mercury in the sign of Aries warfare there. Maybe even targeting government departments and bureaucracies as well is certainly an ongoing possibility. So looking at the midheaven now, this is the very top of the chart, and having the chart ruler in the 10th house, so remember the chart ruler was Mercury, suggests that the national agenda is being set and directed by the government. Mercury's got a bit of dignity by term here, but is in fairly neutral territory. So it's not really, like in the best of condition, but it's not in the worst of condition either. So if Aries is the government and the ruler of Aries represents the prime minister, Mars in Aquarius is Mr. Anthony Albanese. And I mentioned earlier that Mars was trine the ascendant, and that aspect suggests there's affinity between the prime minister and, the nation as a whole. So it's better to have an affinity than not. Signified by Mars suggests that Albanese is feeling quite energetic and perhaps a little urgency around the Aquarian reforms he'd like to implement. There may also be sort of some concern around, debt and spending there. His, fortunes, because of that trine to the ascendant, also appear to be closely tied to those 8th house topics of taxation, superannuation, debt, and potential disasters. So the next Australian federal election will be held on or before the 27th of September 2025. And that's outside of the forecast period for this Ingress to sort of, look at what's going to happen then at the next federal election. We'd be looking at the next Aries Ingress in March 2025. So the chart here certainly suggests that there won't be an early election. As a fixed sign, the Prime Minister looks very focused on the long-term financial trajectory of the country. And I think that's a good thing to sort of, not be trying, like to capitalize politically on, perhaps good opinion polls. He's looking at, the more serious stuff, the stuff that, few of us like to look at in the 8th house. So while we're over in the 8th house, we may notice that Pluto is lurking ominously on the cusp at the very beginning of Aquarius. Pluto is a wealth planet associated with the underworld, so it's got a natural connection to mining as well. That basically a lot of mines happen underground. I wonder, because of the position of Pluto on the eighth house cusp, if there'll be some adjustments to the subsidies directed towards mining companies and the taxation that they pay. So Pluto is connected to the word plutocracy, and one of the definitions of plutocracy is a wealthy class that controls the government. Control is another sort of Plutonian word. And that there may be issues coming to the fore around technology companies because Pluto's in Aquarius. I'm thinking companies like Meta and like the data hoarding that companies have been doing for years, and we're now becoming sort of aware of how kind of loosey-goosey they've been with that data retention. And as I mentioned at the start of this discussion, there's this persistent but out there Aquarian idea of nuclear power generation. So the position of Pluto on the eighth house cusp suggests that nuclear industry is an economic drain rather than an earner. Income comes into the second house, and debt is the eighth house, things that you spend on, like money that you lose and have to give to somebody else. So Pluto's important in this chart because it's opposite the moon, and the moon represents the people, the national mood, and that is in a trine to the sun, which is central to this ingress to begin with, because this chart is a snapshot of the moment that the sun moves into Aries. So as far as the people are concerned, if it's not going to make them rich, there's no way that people will side with nuclear development. And the people want big companies, in a broader sense, to pay their fair share, and tax reform could certainly become an intense debate in the coming year. The people are really, we'll dive a little bit deeper into the luminaries. Particularly, let's start with the moon. The moon is opposite Pluto. The moon is in Leo on the second house cusp. You couldn't really have a stronger statement that the people are focused on their income and the cost of living. And this configuration strongly suggests that the people's top priority is returning to generous economic conditions. And they're not shy about expressing their wants, needs, and desires. Leo's a fire sign. It expresses itself. The people, me included, we want to enjoy life. We want to be entertained. We want to catch a live show or go to a game. But oh my God, if money isn't like this constant, presence in our life, we have to think about what we're spending our money on and making sure that, we've got enough. Like it's a squeeze. So it's hard to live out your celebrity fantasies while checking receipts. Leo's, a bit of a glamorous sign. We want to be able to sort of live life to the fullest, and we can't really do that at the moment. So the moon is in a separating trine from the sun, which suggests that people appreciate the efforts of the prime minister. The sun represents the king or the leader of the country. So, the Mars trine the ascendant, the moon trine to the sun, it suggests that people recognize the efforts of the leadership to return the nation to prosperity. And the moon's next aspect, it takes quite a while to perfect, but it's the square to Jupiter in the 11th house, the house of hope, which seems to emphasize the people's dreams of wealth and luxury. So fingers crossed by the end of this Aries ingress that we'll all feel a little bit more comfortable and, be able to sort of, relax one of the notches on our belts. So when we talk about wealth in Australia, you really can't avoid talking real estate. Real estate's down here in the fourth house, where it's about the land, it's about people's home, and our national insatiable desire to invest in property. Libra's on the fourth house cusp, and the south node is there. And this suggests that fourth house matters are subject to Libran ideals of fairness, justice, and laws, which offer release and reduction. Now, I'd love to say this indicates housing becomes more affordable and maybe even that idea of a bubble bursting. But I think more realistically, it suggests a continued lack of availability. With the South Node, there's this idea of draining away, of insufficiency. And this idea of lack is backed up by Venus, the ruling planet of Libra, up here on the cusp of the ninth house, which relates to courts and laws, legislation more broadly, and it's applying to the planet of lack, Saturn. So it certainly looks like migrants will get the blame. Remember, migrants are a ninth house topic and kind of become the scapegoat. And goats are creatures of Saturn, often sacrificed to the gods. So Saturn and Venus here suggest ongoing legal and political wrangling because Venus is also the opposition leader, and he's likely to continue conversations around borders and immigration. So the government's the 10th house, the opposition's the 4th house. So just like Mars, the ruler of Aries, is the prime minister, the ruler of the opposition party is the planet that rules the 4th house, and that's Venus. So that's Peter Dutton, Venus. So glamorous. So Saturn and Venus on the ninth house cusp suggests ongoing legal and political wrangling there. And Dutton appears to have some success in arguing in this familiar political territory. But eventually that Venus will meet with Saturn bringing a dose of reality. He's already been indirectly cautioned by intelligence and border control officials to curb his rhetoric. So maybe there's a more serious incident along those lines in the coming year. Saturn is also a natural significator of the elderly. And because Venus, sweet Venus, is approaching Saturn in this chart, that suggests something good is coming to the elderly. I was preparing my notes for this presentation, and there was a report from a government task force into aged care funding arrangements that came out. So it may be that something concrete comes out of that report. And, you know, part of how we look after our old people is fixed in the year ahead. So this planetary combination suggests that the legislation about improving the situation of the aged is connected to the home and real estate assets, because that sweet thing that's coming to them relates to fourth house topics. So let's finally get to the sun, which is the reason we've cast this chart in the first place. So the sun positioned in like 0 Aries it softens that trine between the moon and Pluto. The sun in the ninth house indicates the core generative force of the chart. The thing that's driving Australia in the coming year is overseas. So there's a focus on international relations, immigration, travel, religion, and higher education. The ninth house placement of the sun combined with the prominent Mercury suggests that there's likely to be significant developments related to education, which we've gone through earlier. So as far as education goes, I know that a higher education review was completed a few weeks ago as well, and there's likely to be additional funding there. There's a mutual reception, which is rather lovely, between Venus in Jupiter's sign, Pisces, and then if we go over to Venus's sign, Taurus, there's Jupiter there. So they're also in a sextile too. So we've got the sweetness of and generosity of Venus with that knowledge-hungry Jupiter. And so the 11th house is the government's resources as well. So it looks like some restructuring and spending on higher education will happen. So transport and travel is another area that's, kind of bubbled up to the surface as well. There's been lots of rumblings about the fuel efficiency standard, which is a bit kind of a mercurial topic, as, cars are how we get around locally. With that fuel efficiency standard, electric car makers have begun quitting the National Car Lobby Body, which is called the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries, because they're making misleading claims about government policy potentially driving up car prices. So like there's a bit of an argument there for that being more of a third house topic, but the third house in this chart is also ruled by Mercury there. Foreign affairs relates to the 9th house, and Venus there, she is all about peace and harmony. But one sort of interesting thing about these Venusian star goddesses back in the day is that, like, more ancient iterations of that goddess were also about war as well as peace. So in Pisces, though, she's definitely more about peace, harmony, maybe even some mung beans. And this dream of peace and harmony is particularly vivid when she's in Pisces. So being a water sign, maritime boundaries and agreements are highlighted. And because Venus also rules the 4th house and Saturn is linked to mining, undersea excavation might also be in the news, perhaps with collaborative projects with other nations that we, share water boundaries with. Okay, so this chart is a Wednesday, so that's the day of Mercury, and in Canberra, it will be the hour of Venus. That gives Venus a little bit of an points to Venus. That the hour ruler often goes, look at me, look at that, there's something there. And that highlights the mutual reception between exalted Venus and Jupiter on the 11th house cusp applying to Uranus. So even though Venus is somewhat curtailed by Saturn, she's by far the most dignified planet in this chart. And I feel that's really encouraging for us to think a little bigger, aim a little higher than perhaps we have been, and to invest in and share big ideas, enduring ones, to bring in those Saturnian concepts of, long-term goals, and to come together and decide where we want to go as a nation. All right, I did have some other charts up my sleeve, but I feel like we've perhaps, I feel like I've talked enough, and I wanted to sort of throw it open to see if anybody had any questions or thoughts about, or even something that you've seen perhaps in the news or you're wondering about for Australia in the year ahead. You can just kind of pipe in or pop it in the chat if you'd prefer not to talk.
I'll say something.
Then please do.
So there's a couple of things I find really interesting, though. The prime minister, so being in the 8th house and trining to that and being in Aquarius is interesting. I liked what you said about that, and it kind of gave me this. I always get the sense of Aquarius as like this kind of a reforming idea. And I think my original thoughts about the new prime minister was that he was going to be much like the other one, even though he was the opposing side.
Yep.
Yeah. I was kind of thinking, he's kind of, sure, there's a different label here, a different party label, but they're all going to do the same thing. But I'm kind of getting the sense that this is different here.
Yeah. I mean, they certainly look the same, like kind of middle-aged white guys with big brown heads.
Yeah.
But Scott Morrison, the previous prime minister, he was from the Australian Conservative Party, bizarrely called the Liberal Party, but that's kind of like a small small L Liberal. And that prime minister was from the right. He tended towards the right, centre right of that Liberal Party, whereas the current prime minister, Albanese, he is from the left faction of the Labor Party, which is probably used to be a bit further left than they are, and they're now a bit more of a centrist party these days. But so even though they're, they kind of look much of a muchness, and Australia's system of government with preferential voting kind of means that moderate, middle of the road people, tend to get voted in. So that's why these kind of parties tend to look a bit the same. There are sort of nuances, but generally, Australia takes the middle path, and we don't tend to get one populist leader elected, which perhaps is what happens in the United States, although your system of government is quite structured rather differently to what we've got. But Albanese, as a bit of a lefty, certainly tends towards reform, and he's been around a long time. He's pretty much a career politician. So he hasn't come from sort of a business background. He's come from a union background, student politics, things like that. And he had a reform agenda, but suffered a big kick in the guts with the voice referendum that he supported, not being successful in the 2023 Ingress year. No, you're on mute. I might. Oh, there you go.
Sorry about that. Been there
You're
talking
right.
and you can't. Well, that is interesting. Okay. So he kind of suffered a setback.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm wondering, yeah, maybe that has some influence in this coming.
He's a Pisces too, which I find quite interesting. And perhaps more interesting given that Saturn's in Pisces at the moment, and it perhaps speaks to all the extra responsibility that you take on when you're the leader of the nation. I think some prime ministers wear it easier than others.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm
Interesting.
sure he's got things keeping him up at night, with his signifier in the eighth house of, this coming Ingress chart. But I think his relationship to the people and that sense of responsibility that he's got probably sort of, get him to pony up and do the job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, the other thing, I mean, definitely the moon opposite Pluto is really, really interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
it's quite a powerful
I,
statement, isn't it?
yeah, and when you were talking about it, I kept thinking about Neptune is squaring the ascendant, and
Mm.
I have that in my chart, my natal chart, and it took a while, but I kind of recognized how that was affecting my life, being
Okay.
this kind of fantasy about connecting to things. It's interesting that it's close to the sun at the ingress, and it's squaring the ascendant. I'm thinking that you already mentioned something about some kind of deception taking place, and that I kind of get that sense of maybe people, the people being in that second house, maybe waking up with that Pluto across from them to sort of this deception. And maybe or whatever the deception is. I mean, I could say my own opinion, but I won't. But that that there's a kind of an awakening potential there with the moon and Leo. Like you said, it's like something wants to come out. And
Yeah.
yeah.
It
Um,
kind of in a way, like when if like I did have the colonization chart up my sleeve up here. It's because I mean an Ingress chart always relates, like it's a bit like a birth chart. Like it needs to be rooted, it needs to be radical. So like this is the Ingress chart for Australia, and then we could overlay that on either the colonization chart, the 1788 chart, which has a bit of a Neptune flavor in that it was kind of based on the lie of terra nullius. So kind of like a whole the modern Australia has been built on a big fat porky.
Yeah.
And like that's there, and like there's like national myths that we kind of reach back into. I'm sure like most nations have these kind of myths, like in Australia it's like about mateship and the fair go and things. And I think perhaps this chart in particular, with that moon on the second house cusp opposite that Pluto, is like, well, how much of a fair go do you really get with all these kind of really strong, dominant, overarching systems that perhaps we're waking up to now that it's obvious through technological advancement with like data leaks and manipulation of the news and things like that, and the information you see through algorithms and things. But I think it's a really old story, like, and has been going on for a long time. Newspapers in Australia, because they're really owned by largely one company, Mr. Murdoch, like they used to have an outsized influence on who would be voted in, because they were the dominant kind of media that was consumed right across the country. So like whatever story was favored editorially would influence a lot of the voters. But now that's kind of happening through more dispersed technological channels. And maybe because it's new, we're like, oh, what? Well, that's a bit different. And so we get, through like a more modern lens, we get a greater perspective on, the lies that we've been fed for, decades, if not hundreds of years.
Yeah. Wow. So interesting.
Yeah, I always like doing the Aries Ingress charts. Pretty nerdy, but I like to get my nerd on once a year and come out of the political, commentary closet and yeah, just sort of take a different perspective. Because even Rupert Murdoch doesn't boss around the planets, does he? He can write what he likes in his
Right.
newspapers.
That's right.
Yeah, he doesn't get to decide which sign the moon's in at the Aries Ingress.
That's exactly right.
I'm sure
Yes.
he would if he could. Hmm.
Well, yeah, he's probably working it. He's trying to work on something right now, I
Yeah.
assume, but um well, it looks like there's a lot of potential. I mean, with something going on in the 10th house there, like you were talking about, having
Yeah.
the North Node, Mercury's there, Chiron's there. Everything you were talking about, I was thinking that something just like breakthroughs or
Yes.
really
Yeah.
challenging changes are taking place in the realm of government or authority,
Yeah.
perhaps, maybe in general.
Yeah, there
So,
seems to be a sense of ambition there, like out of necessity. But that Jupiter coming to
mhm,
Uranus, what is it?
mhm,
It's about a
right.
month after, I think,
Yeah, something like
this chart.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that mutual reception between the benefics. I think
Mhm.
that indicates a sense of optimism and, like you said, that breakthroughs. And technology, it's a tool, it can help us, or we can sort of, become enslaved to it. So there's tension there, but there's also, yeah, some really high-minded aspiration, I think, to come together and improve the situation for everybody. Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious to see what happens in Australia
Yeah.
this coming. Really
Well, I'll be
interesting.
back for the Ingress in 2025.
Of
And
course.
yeah, I'll do a bit of a review because it is interesting to kind
Yeah.
of look back before you look forward. And I think
Yeah.
like if we think back, like, you know, there seems to be a bit like solar returns, like there's a bit of a link, a bit of a story as each year builds on the past. And I think that third house kind of secrets, talky Mercury kind of yeah, thread that's was present in the 2023 chart is continuing on in the 2024 chart as well. I mean, it's quite
Yeah.
different, but yeah, there are continuing themes as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, I hope some of the good stuff that I've mentioned comes true for us.
Okay.
And yeah, I hope the bad stuff isn't quite as bad. Yeah. Thank you to everybody that tuned in live, and hi to everyone looking at the recording. Keep your eyes peeled for the Eclipse anti-challenge surrender online thingy that I'm going to be doing. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you at the next Aries Ingress. Yeah. Have a fantastic day, and happy Ingress to you all. Bye.